My name isn't John Green, but you can bet I'm stealing a show. Welcome to Crash Course to U.S. History, Voyager Edition. Alright, so if you don't know what we're about to be doing, shame on you. You need to start trying harder. It's about the end of the year now, or Miss Dropper decided to show this in class. You need to stop slacking off. Unless you're reading the textbook and haven't been watching the videos, in which case, good on you, you're actually doing your homework. Regardless of your study habits, however, I'm here to talk about Time Period 6. So sit down, grab a bit of popcorn, we've got a lot to cover. Time Period 6 has three major key concepts that the College Board uses to define the area. Key Concept 6.1 states that technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets encourage the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. Key Concept 6.2, the migrations that accompanied industrialization transformed both urban and rural areas of the United States and caused dramatic social and cultural change. And Key Concept 6.3, the Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. So, for this video, we're going to be going through the key concepts one by one, going from 1 to 3, so we're going to have to jump around a little bit due to years not quite lining up in that order. So, starting with time period 1, or key concept 1, my apologies. What technological advances and new markets opened up in the U.S. during the time period? Think really, really hard about this. It's a tough question, but I gotta say, I can't tell. If you didn't get the incredibly subtle imagery, yes, there was a lot of stuff! Time period 6 is commonly referred to as the Gilded Age. Remember that term? It's an important one. Due to the nation seeming to have enough wealth to gild the streets or give them a thin golden coating, kind of like the Statue of Liberty's torch. There were a couple major figureheads that led to the growth of the nation's wealth. Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller, with their incredibly influential industries, steel, railroads, and oil, respectively. While you review for the Gilded Age, it's important that you associate the proper name with the proper person. So here's an easy way to remember it. Steel goes in cars. Carnegie made steel. Vanderbilt built the railroad. And oil comes from the earth. Earth has rocks. I don't know. Rockefeller found oil. He's the last one left. I know it's dumb, but mnemonics like that'll help a lot. Back on topic, let's focus on John D. Rockefeller. In 1870, Rockefeller organized Standard Oil. The Standard Oil Company was one of the first major companies organized. Oil was an increasingly popular industry in the 19th century, as it was more and more commonly used in homes as a source of heating and lighting. Rockefeller, seeing an opportunity, decided to create an empire. Rockefeller organized Standard Oil in 1870 and made it his goal to single-handedly run the oil industry. In 1882, leading up to 1882, Rockefeller used horizontal integration, the purchasing of companies relating to the same industry, to buy up his competitors one by one to form the Standard Oil Trust in 1882, which became the largest oil company in the world. Now, before we move on, I'm going to make a small note that can be talked about more later. This was only possible because the government at the time followed laissez-faire policies and was very pro-business. Moving on, we're going to talk about Carnegie. Carnegie was the steel producer who created, bought, and maintained a steel empire. Carnegie opened the world's largest steel plant in 1875, and he reinvented the industry. Carnegie used new steel-producing methods and immigrant labor to make his steel cheaper than any other companies. Carnegie hired Henry Frick to manage his business, which would result in an increased productivity by cutting corners. Frick, however, did this a little too well, resulting in a steel failure at the Johnstown Dam, and he really made the working conditions for workers very, very poor. The Homestead strike actually occurred in protest of this. However, Carnegie Steel came out the victor from the strike, and unions suffered a major blow once again. More on that later. Next, let's talk about railroads. Railroads were one of the biggest industries in the growing U.S. throughout time period 6, and many people realized the power they would have. The U.S. government was unable to fund the Transcontinental Railroad that Lincoln had approved in 1869. Resulting in production getting subsidized to smaller companies. As contracts were given to companies, problems arose such as the Credit Mobilier scandal. I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong, it has accents in it. Accents. where company executives would form their own construction companies and lease out the work to their secondary company for far more than the work was worth. Credit Mobilier was an example of one of these, and let's just say the mother company isn't doing too well anymore. They got driven broke by this new company that the vice president made. Let's see, where were we? Yeah, so Vanderbilt was one of the few major railroad executives who avoided scandals such as this and rose to success. Railroads were used to ship goods all over the U.S., furthermore allowing Richard Sears to create the first mail-order catalog and the now enormous company Sears. I know you probably haven't heard of it, but it's probably because you live in a more secluded place than me. J.P. Morgan, one of the most influential men in history, was a banker during the Gilded Age, and time period 7 as well. He had a major role in the development of railroads and steel. Shortly following the time period, Morgan fused the Federal Steel Company, which he had financed, with Carnegie Steel and other smaller companies to form the U.S. Steel Corporation, the world's first billion-dollar industry. Billion! With a B, that's a lot of freaking money! Morgan also financed several investors, such as Edison and Ford, and created the General Electric Company. They would become a lot more influential down the road, in time period 7. Just felt like they were worth mentioning, because the borders of the time periods kind of overlap a little. It's a little weird. So now, before moving on to the second key concept, we're going to look back at one of the time period's major documents. Normally it'd be a mystery, but I'm not John Green. I don't know various documents from history. I've only taken this class once. So I'm just going to tell you right now, it is The Gospel of Wealth, written by Andrew Carnegie, and because this video has a time budget, and we're running a little low right now, I'm going to break it down into a hippoed form, rather than reading off to you, because it's a couple pages long. So, let's start with historical context. Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth shortly after the Johnstown flood, a flood that occurred as a consequence of Henry Frick cutting too many corners with the Carnegie Steel's production process. Steel in the Johnstown Dam was Carnegie Steel, and feeling responsible, Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth in response to both the tragedy of Johnstown and the influx of immigrants that the U.S. received throughout the time period, which, by the way, resulted in the opening of Ellis Island to help funnel them through. The intended audience for The Gospel of Wealth was the richer members of the American society. Carnegie may have intended it to reach the rich worldwide, but that wasn't achieved until it was published in a journal in 2003 as kind of a throwback to how things used to be. The point of view we had here, Carnegie, when he wrote this, was one of the richest men in the world, and his name was attached to a tragedy that had just killed thousands. Carnegie also happened to be a Scottish immigrant whose family was rather poor, requiring him to acquire his wealth entirely on his own. As a consequence of this, he had seen both sides of the coin, what it felt like to be rich and what it felt like to be poor. This kind of influenced the purpose following this tragedy. The Gospel of Wealth was a call to action aimed at the wealthy of America. Carnegie hoped that his memoir, essay, article thingy would touch the hearts of the rich and encourage them to distribute their wealth responsibly so as to promote the U.S. economy and support lower members of society. He was really just encouraging philanthropic work so that people could really just flourish, and it wouldn't just be all the wealth accumulated in one place, kind of like it is today. The 1% has like 50% or something, probably more. A bit of outside information we had concerning this. Shortly after writing The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie spent about 90% of his fortune on philanthropic work like he was promoting. He created several libraries, now known as the Carnegie Libraries, and they're referred to as free libraries, and donated to charities all around the U.S. As I kind of mentioned before, his steel company later fused with others to create one of the largest monopolies of all time, really. They're kind of illegal now. It's kind of in the record books. Before The Gospel of Wealth, however, workers under Carnegie suffered from very poor conditions and received minimal pay as a result of Henry Frick running most of the business decisions. Now, for key concept 6.2. The migrations that accompanied industrialization transformed both urban and rural areas of the United States and caused dramatic social and cultural change. Key concepts 1 and 2 are a bit related because they both have a lot to do with immigrants. Immigrants flooded to the U.S. throughout the time period, hearing about the economic successes of people such as Carnegie and better living conditions. This influx of immigrants put huge economic strain on the U.S., resulting in the Homestead Act, an attempt from the U.S. government to get... Oh, geez, I'm sorry, I've been a little sick lately. An attempt by the U.S. government to get people out of big cities and kind of spread out a little more into the now purchased West. The Homestead Act stated that the U.S. would give away plots of land to the now easier-to-access West, thanks to the Transcontinental Railroad, as long as people would go and farm it. Settlers traveled west, killing off the entire U.S. buffalo population in the process, as they built railroads and new settlements, creating a new culture in the U.S. People who went out west were largely European immigrants with nothing, and soon most of them returned east with nothing. A period known as the harsh winter devastated fields and cattle throughout the 1880s. This made the agrarian culture the government had half promoted. They didn't really do much to help. Until that time, fairly inhabitable. Prior to the harsh winter, however, cattle farmers were very successful out west and created the concept of what we now know as cowboys. I know you haven't heard of them. Once again, I'm sure you all live in an even more secluded place than me. Cowboys were charged with driving cattle across lands, or from west to east across the land, and in this process, lots of them would trample farmers' fields. There was nothing really protecting them at this point. They were just kind of out there. This really opened up some new markets, such as leather for vests like these. I know they're impressive. No need to compliment me. Mostly dealing with leatherworks and meat production. A retaliation to this meat production, however, covered in time period 7 again, but borders a variant, is a book known as The Jungle. It goes into great detail about the atrocities that go on in meat factories, and kind of offers criticism, hoping that people would reform. I'm assuming we did, because now we have the EPA that protects us, FDA. We got people protecting us now. You're really making things worse in the long run, but that's my opinion. Anyways, transporting cattle resulted in many troubles for farmers whose crops were trampled, leading to the production of barbed wire. Fancy, I know. Which ended cattle drives, as it was harder to find enough land to actually drive the cattle on. Fields here, following the harsh winter, were actually like fields that could actually grow stuff now. With the Homestead Act, one of the major continuities between the time periods occurs with mistreatment to Native Americans. Just like with about every prior interaction between the growing American culture and the one originally in America, things went terribly wrong. As immigrants and poor Americans traveled out west, conflicts arose, and the new settlers and the natives killed each other a couple times. In 1877, the Nez Perce War, which I probably pronounced wrong, is one example of conflict, as the Nez Perce Indians fought with the settlers. The Indians were eventually forced to surrender after several months, and were forced off their land to a designated Indian reservation that would once again have its borders violated a bit further down the road. Other major Indian conflicts during this time are the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was between settlers and the Lakota Indians, and the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was the slaughter of hundreds of Lakota, including women and children. The men weren't fighting back either, but I believe it's pathos that statement occurs to. I don't know, Mr. Spring has had me stressed lately. That concludes Key Concept 2, and now we're going to move on to Key Concept 3. The Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. To begin with Key Concept 3, I'm going to finish talking about the Native Americans. The Indian Appropriation Acts were a group of acts that ended the idea that Native Americans were their own independent group of people. This shift in cultural ideas would result in many hardships for the Indians, as settlers were no longer obligated to stay off their land. The conflicts with the Lakotas I just mentioned, the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Wounded Knee Massacre, Both occurred not long after the re-idealizing of Native Americans. Alright, so I know that was depressing, but we're done talking about the Native Americans and how they've been killed many times, I promise. Now we get to talk about some new movements and reform efforts in America's main society. Politics here are a bit interesting. We got through several of what we call forgettable presidents, such as Grant, Hayes, Garfield, his replacement Arthur after he's assassinated, Cleveland, Harrison, and Cleveland again. He's the same guy, he just kind of served 2 non-consecutive terms. No big deal. He's the only guy who's done it. Over the span of these 6 presidents, 7 if you want to double count Cleveland, but I'm not going to, laissez-faire policies were in effect, which is kind of why they're forgettable. They didn't do much, they just kind of let things take their own course. These laissez-faire policies largely allow the business moves that we've talked about back in Key Concept 1. Rewind this video if you don't remember it. You're pathetic if you don't. The biggest things relating to the federal governments were scandals such as the Whiskey Ring scandal, which was under Grant, wherein many of Grant's appointees were found to be evading taxes relating to the distillation and consumption of alcohol. Hence, Whiskey Ring being the name. In 1883, the Pendleton Act was passed in an attempt to curb corruption by installing a government test that government employees would have to pass in order to gain employment. This included presidents, senators, mayors, probably. Made it harder to be corrupted. Other major social movements are the Chinese Exclusion Act, which outlawed Chinese immigration to the U.S., the Unusual Act remained in effect from 1882 to 1943, which was several years after it was supposed to end. It was only meant to last 10 years, but it got reinstated, renewed, whatever you want to say. And it kind of made it really hard for Chinese to get into the country, impossible even. However, the Chinese that were already here weren't affected much. In fact, Chinese laborers were the most common working on the Transcontinental Railroad that enabled the growth of the U.S. Final topics for this video will be presented in a sort of speed round, because we're running really short on time at this point. In politics, we had the People's Populist Party. They were a group of Americans that wanted to refocus on agrarian policies and were highly critical of capitalism, like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan. All of them, they were against them. Later merged with the Democratic Party, although there is a small little group still around. For social movements, we have the Hull House, which opened up in Chicago, opened up by Jane Addams. It was meant to help train the poorer members of society to get better jobs and kind of just get them reinstalled back into society. It didn't quite follow the Gospel of Wealth standards because Jane Addams wasn't nearly the wealthy 1% that Carnegie was addressing, but it was a good effort. She did a lot, and there were several other beneficial organizations throughout America at this time. So, next we have President Grant passing the Yellowstone National Park Act, which showed that people were beginning to value nature. Hooray! Roosevelt will love ya. He's next, though. A last thing, just a little tidbit. U.S. bought Alaska and Hawaii during this time. I know it's not important. Yeah. 2 new states, hooray. But this really just marked the end of U.S. expansion in terms of land. So, I want to say thank you for sticking around so long for my video. I'm sorry if I misspoke a bit. Like I said, I've been a little sick lately. It's been hard for me to speak. You're probably watching this right before the AP exam, so best of luck to you. You'll do great. If not, you'll do great. I don't know why I bothered with that. But I'll see you later. Bye.